Hey, how are you? I know you are probably confused with all this American political stuff. So, I'm 45 years old. I come from the center of America. I've seen, well, at least since I was a kid, president that I remember was Reagan. And after Reagan, of course, we had Bush and we had, um, I believe it was Clinton. And from Clinton, we had um, who came after Bush Jr. And then we got um, Barack Obama, and then we got President Trump. So those are the presidents that I remember. I mean, obviously before Reagan there was Carter, and I don't know the whole sequence before that. So from Reagan to Bush to Clinton to Obama, sorry, to Bush Jr. to Obama to Trump, it's quite a few presidents, quite a few races that I've seen. And ultimately, I think what's really helpful is to look at the data. And what does the data actually show about Americans? So this is an interesting poll. You may not know this, but actually 20% of Americans are Republican, 20% are Democrat, and 40% are independent. In other words, the data shows that most Americans are neither Republican nor they are Democrat. However, Pew, which is a non-biased, it's a nonpartisan think tank, and they do amazing research. So Pew, and I think her name is Rebecca Kimmel. I once wrote to her, CEO of Pew, and she told me that Mr. Pew himself said, "Tell the truth and trust the people." So let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they don't have an agenda and they're telling the truth. So Pew has major research into, they subcategorize the conservatives and the liberals. And it turns out that if you subcategorize conservative and liberals, you'll find that there's about 45% of the country that's on the conservative spectrum, 45% on the liberal spectrum. And then you have 10%, which is sort of apolitical. They have no opinions or they don't vote. They're just like not connected whatsoever. Now, what's also important to understand is that there are four different types of conservatives, and there's a very, very big difference between these types. You could check out the Pew poll on itself. It's called Political Typography. And there's also four different types of liberals. And again, they're very, very different. But what's pretty interesting is that the Republican Party, right, so the 45% of conservatives that support that are the kind of mainstay of the Republican Party is actually 17% of our country, and they are what can be termed compassionate conservatives. In other words, they are really closer to the independent. As we said before, 40% of the country is independent. They're really much closer to independent than being hardcore conservatives. And they're a very diverse group of people. They use their minds. 15% of blacks, for example, voted for Trump. So you can't really just categorize people that it's all like this, it's all like that. It's not like that. But the hallmark of the average Republican, or I shouldn't say the average Republican, 45% of Republicans, and the most active part of the Republican Party is compassionate conservatives, which are people that are just mature and they're using their head. So it's very easy to kind of be a liberal. And the reason it's easy to be a liberal is because basically the difference between, there's a great line. It says, if you're not a liberal by the time you're 20, you have no head. If you're not a conservative by the time you're 30, you have no heart. And I really fell into that category. By the time I was 20, I was definitely a liberal. By the time I was 30, I was definitely a conservative. So the question is, why are liberals naive? And the answer is it's human nature to be naive until you've had experience. They have another line that a liberal is a white man that hasn't been stabbed. Anybody who's lived in Africa for 15 years, as I've done, doesn't have any question about what Africans are capable of. But if you're living in some kind of white suburban neighborhood, you don't want to think negatively. I've seen somebody that was going to be eaten, and thank God a Jewish man saved her. But I mean, literally, had this guy not saved her, she would have been eaten. And so, and that why? Because the medicine man would have killed her for her liver, and some businessman would have eaten her liver. He would have thought that makes him powerful. Cannibalism is alive and well in many parts of Africa. So, once you see reality, you can't unsee reality, and then you have to deal with what you've seen and make it better. And that's really the only way you're going to make things better, is not by pretending bad things don't exist. And this is very, very, very critical, because in liberals today, there are actually two types of liberals. There are the naive liberals, which want a beautiful world, which in fact the compassionate conservatives do as well. It's just a question of the mechanism to get there. And then there are the radical liberals. Now, radicalism and naive are actually, in a certain sense, two sides of the same coin, even though they're directly opposite. Because radicalism is hatred. And it's very, very critical to understand this. One of the greatest Jewish saints, so there have been tens, if not hundreds of thousands of these great rabbis and saints and brilliant people and brilliant ladies as well. And one of them, Menachem Mendel of Kotz, said, what is the difference between a lover of truth and a hater of falsehood? And the answer is that the lover of truth always will find, or in his words, he doesn't rest until he finds truth. In other words, if you're seeking truth, then you find what you're seeking. But if what you're seeking is actually a hater of falsehood, meaning you've been abused or you've been hurt by lies, so you hate liars. So what do you find is you find liars. So even though they seem exactly the same, they're exactly opposite. And yet, they're actually two ends of the same spectrum. Why? Because they're both emotions. One is love, one is hate. They're both emotional. They're not coming sort of like this conversation, which is objective. We're looking at all the facts, and we're not just being emotional, oh, my tribe says this. We're looking at the research, and we're getting down to what is the reality at hand. And so to sum it up, the idea of the Liberal Party, the Democratic Party, which really became radicalized, because Clinton was not a radical by any stretch of the imagination. But Obama was a radical. He was anti-Israel. He gave money to Hamas, a terrorist organization, basically rewarding them for shooting rockets at Israel. The first time they shot rockets, he gave them $30 million. The second time, he gave them $50 million for killing people. That's impressive. He gave Iran, the largest state sponsor of terrorism, $150 billion. He created what's called a junta. In Islam, you're not allowed to make peace with the West. Islam sees the world, and this is from Encyclopedia Britannica, and you can research this, but Islam sees the world that you're either in the house of peace or the house of war. According to Islam, the whole world has to be under Sharia law, which is Islamic law, strict Islamic law. Like if you convert out of Islam, they kill you. And if you're not under Sharia law, you're the house of war. That's why, the Muslim Brotherhood, which could very well be Obama was part of, according to the Egyptian newspapers, and he certainly was a big supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood. He got them not elected, he installed them in Egypt, which is insane. They're the worst terrorist organization. They're the source of basically Al-Qaeda and all terrorism. They're the ideology of it. But be that as it may, the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization, and they're in Egypt, and they're fighting. There's a story of a doctor, I saw this from the YouTube, but he was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he meant well. He thought he was going to become more religious, and one of his tasks was to bury an Egyptian policeman alive. And he realized, no, this is not what God wants. But these are sadistic, sick people. And yet, these people are fighting against their own country. Why? Because to them, it's not a secular Islamic state is not okay either. An Islamic state that has, let's say, laws like Western society, law and order, they don't buy into that. So they're against all states. That's really what the revolution in, I think, the 1970s by the Ayatollah Khomeini was all about. Because it's not okay for Iran to be a normal Muslim country. They have to be a radical Muslim country. They don't accept normal. Normal to them is evil. But that's just to their own, to the whole world. They see the whole world, especially any country that was once Islamic. And you can check this out. Whatever I'm saying is 100% true. You can go to my website, nevereveragain.org, and you'll see more about it. So the bottom line is we are dealing with terrorists and radicals. So to support people like that is not a liberal position now. That is a radical position. From my perspective, that's an evil position because you're supporting, ISIS. So the nicest thing you could say about Obama was that he was an idiot and he pulled out of Iraq and Syria, and that allowed the worst terrorist, heinous evil that we've seen in probably generations come into this world. And there were, I don't even want to say, it's just so sick what they did. But the point is that he let them do that. And so we're talking about somebody who was convinced that Islam is a good thing. And Islam is 100%, at least radical Islam, which is the source of all terrorism. And just go to Religion of Tolerance or religionofpeace.com. Since December 11, there's been over 27,000 attacks mainly against Muslims by these terrorists. So these are purely evil, sadistic people that do not believe that anybody has a right, that there should be any country that should exist unless they're under strict Sharia law and their version of Sharia law. So the thing of a junta is that you're only allowed to make a 10-year peace deal because you're not allowed to have peace. It's called the House of War or the House of Peace. So what Obama did is that he made a junta. Remember, there was a 10-year peace deal with Iran. So why did he do a 10-year peace deal? If you don't want them to have nuclear weapons, if his intention was that they shouldn't have nuclear weapons, so why make a 10-year deal? Why not just make a deal like, okay, the guy is giving him $150 billion. So why not make a deal forever? That sounds to me like a better deal than making a 10-year deal, which is going to expire soon. The answer is because it was actually for Iran. It wasn't for America. Because a junta is, after 10 years, that's the maximum amount of time you're allowed to make a deal in Islam. And so these are just one facet. There was this kind of, I think he racked up more debt than like the past, 40 years, like $20 trillion in debt. Try to just spend all the money that you can with no concern about, again, so it's all emotions. It has nothing to do with logic. And so that's really the key difference between the conservatives and the liberals. So the liberals are on a spectrum. Now, conservatives and liberals are on a spectrum. Now, if you put the conservatives on a spectrum to the right, the radical right of the conservatives are obviously, you got these kind of crazy people, and obviously they're nuts. They're emotional. But the radical left of the left party are also nuts. The problem is, and this is very important to realize, is that the radicalization, mainly through Obama, of the left is much greater. Because 17% of the country, which is 17% of the, the percentage of the liberals would be much higher, but it is 45% of the Democratic Party, and the most active part, they are what you would call hardcore liberals, which are really radicals. So you have to understand what's going on here. The Republican Party, which is mainly conservative, so there is a 6%, which you could call radicals, but that's not the main part of the party. There's 45% which are compassionate conservatives. They're basically good people using their head. They're using logic to solve problems. But the Democratic Party, the main part, 17%, they're out of their minds. And you looked at, I'm a conservative, but I was embarrassed for the Democrats looking at that debate. It was just a bunch of idiots shouting at each other. It was a bunch of morons. So why? Because it's all emotion based. There was one person there which I think had a little bit of tact, but the rest of them a bunch of morons. Why? Because it's emotions. Bernie Sanders is a good example. Definitely radical left, completely without any logic. And I'll give you an example. One of the things he said is, somebody asked about climate change. Sorry, Bernie says that we're gonna make outlaw all these things. It's gonna cost 2 million jobs. So number one, that's quite a statement. You know for sure you're gonna make certain restrictions that are gonna 2 million jobs. You know what you just said? No problem, get rid of 2 million jobs. Here's a guy who says that he put people in gulag. That's a guy that hates people. I've never heard any politician in all the history of the United States say something like that. The gulag was a concentration camp, a place where they tortured people. So you're talking about somebody that has deep hatred towards people. And you see that he's not a loving person. He's a radical. And radicals are driven by hate, not by love. And then he says, but that's okay. We're going to make 20 million jobs off clean energy. Now, I've actually investigated clean energy a lot. Nobody's making 20 million jobs. It's a joke. The guy's a liar. And so people have to really understand that, I read a quote. Somebody sent me a quote. Very special guy, a doctor who works in psychotherapy and trauma counseling. And they had a massive thing in Croatia and helping people get over the hate and the issues there. And he had a quote by Einstein. And he said, unthinking obedience to authority is the enemy of truth. Again, unthinking obedience to authority. If you have an authority figure, whoever that person is, and you just say, okay, that guy is right, but you don't think about it, then you're not logical. You don't even know if you're right or wrong. You can't just say somebody's right. Put it to your own brain. We're not talking about somebody else's brain. Give it some thought. Think about it. Is it true? And let me tell you 3 ways on how you know something is true. The first way you know something is true is never by what someone says. It's always about the outcome. So for example, if I tell you socialism is a good idea, so let's just look at socialistic countries. The outcome would be the best proof, right? How does science work? Science work is that I say a theory, this will happen, but I test the theory. If you can't test the theory, you don't know if it's true. The more you test it, the more times it comes out true, the more you know it's probably true. So who tried socialism? Well, communist Russia, massive campaign of socialism. Communist China, they've changed, now they're capitalistic. It was a disaster. Stalin, one socialist president, killed 26 million people because the only way you get socialism, which is basically stealing from the rich to give to the poor, is you have to take all the money of the rich. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, you create laws and you create these camps against the rich, but eventually the country doesn't have any money because the money actually comes, genius, from taxing the rich. And I don't want to even go into too much of this debate. It's just so stupid. Like, what do you think? Let's say you have a table, right? And I need wood. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to cut the table in half. I'm going to burn wood. I'm going to cut it in 3/4. I'm going to burn wood. Well, eventually you ain't going to have any wood to burn. And so to make money, investors have to be able to make money, and then you tax a little bit, and there's money that's going around in a circle. But if you just take off 3/4 of the table, there's not enough money for people to make money. There's not enough incentive, and nobody has money. The government doesn't have money, the poor don't have money, and the rich don't have money. Everybody's equally, and Venezuela is the perfect example. People are starving. They don't have soap. They don't have the basic necessities. And so if you have a brain, if you can stop for a second And a lot of people, they're addicted to what they think is their tribe. You think these people are my people. Let me ask you a question. Any one of those people will give you $100? There are people that I love, and they'd come to me and say, can I have $100? I'd say, immediately. Now, there are a lot of people, they're strangers. Can I have $100? My first thought is, why do you need $100? What are you, a comment? Do you need it? Do you not need it? Okay, give me a good story. You really need 100. I'll give you 100. I have a good heart. But if I have love in my heart, I'll give you immediately. There's a sense of trust. So sometimes people have love in their heart and trust, but ask yourself the question, would they give you $100? And if the answer is no, they're not your tribe. Because unless somebody's really willing to give you $100, they don't love you. It's just that simple. Now, of course, you should have love in your heart for everyone. But don't be a fool. Don't think that this guy Bernie would ever give you $100. He'd never give anyone $100. The guy is a radical hater. And he would do what Chavez did, take all the money, and that's it. Make the whole country poor. And that would make him happy because he has hatred. He has anger in the heart. And so the first way that you can tell if something is true or not is look at the results. If the results are bad, then it's not true. It's really simple. Of course, everyone's going to say it's a very, very important thing. Hitler came around. He says, I'm a good guy. Everybody else is evil. But what did he do? He murdered millions upon millions of people. Everybody's going to say, I'm the good one. And the more they're against others, the more evil they are. Because if what you're standing for is assisting the poor, which is obviously a good thing, why are you against the rich? Who gives them the most charity? The rich. Warren Buffett, one of the richest men, gave $53 billion to charity. Bill Gates, all he does is he spends his time and his brilliant brain on giving charity. Most of the billionaires are going to give half their money away to charity. Never before in history have people given more charity. America, based on Gallup International Polls, is the second kindest country in the world. Apart from one country where there's a tradition to give these Buddhist monks food. But you take that out, just in helping people, we are the ones that give the most charity. So this idea that the rich are evil is just not true. And so the idea comes from jealousy. And jealousy is when you feel hurt. Obama was a perfect example of jealousy. Why? He wrote a book called The Dreams of My Father. He was a hurt person. One of his coaches, he was complaining about whites, this and that. He said he was just missing his father. That's all it was. He felt abandoned first by his father, and then his mother dropped him off at his grandfather. And so this was a person who hated people. That's all it was. You can see he's not a person that has calmness or love in his heart. And sure, there's an arrogant smugness, but that's not love. That's delusions of grandeur. So now let me give you the second way that you can tell if something is true. The second way you can tell if something is true is there's a famous Judaic teaching. It says how emes maskemes, truth agrees with itself from all sides. How do you know if something is scientifically correct? Well, if every time you do the experiment, it's correct. If one time you do the experiment and it doesn't work, it's just not correct. You can make sure that your experiment wasn't a problem. And so when you look at all of human history, you look at everything that exists, we are going through a cycle. Empires basically live for about 200 years. And then they dissolve. And how do they dissolve? They dissolve from the stupidity of the people within. And this is not just my saying. We're talking about major studies, right? The rise and fall of the Roman Empire by a British historian. And his whole goal was to understand how empires fall. Because they do. They rise and they fall. And usually in a 200-year cycle. And we're in about the end of the 200-year cycle. And what's really interesting is, and there's studies, we're talking about all the empires that have ever risen, and all of them have fallen. What is the reason? And the reason is like this. In order to create an empire again, it takes logic, right? You have to have rules and systems that work. In order for an economy to work, there has to be safety. And additionally, there also has to be innovation. Now, safety allows our brains to be innovative. If I'm worried about what other people are going to say it to me, I'm too busy. It's like the hard drive is too busy with this program. It doesn't have room for creativity. Our right brain is creative. Our left brain is logical and more fear-based because there's more to fear. And our prefrontal is executive functioning, like just do it now. So when we have fear, we don't have the space to be creative. We're like, I just gotta put food on the table now. I don't have space to think. So it takes a lot of prosperity, which is based on safety, which is based on rules of how society should function. Because if you take away, this thing, these crazy radical liberals which are against police. Well, we have a professor, in our community, and he was, and you can look this up, there was one day, Montreal, Canada, when the police went on strike. So he's driving home, and suddenly he sees people going through red lights. And suddenly there are bank robberies, and there are robberies in homes in one day in a civilized society. When the police were not around by Hurricane Katrina, in a day, these gangs, they started raping women, shooting at the helicopters, trying to save them in one day. We're not talking about a year society dissolved. In a day. Why? Because there are people that are evil. And they come from difficult backgrounds where power was everything. And they don't care about anything. They'll use any power in the world to rape and to steal because that's what they want. And they don't care. They have no shame. They just don't care. And so it takes a lot to make a force, a civilization where the government can control those evil people. I'm not saying all people, I'm very against, in general, the whole structure of jail. I think there are better sentencing systems. But if there weren't 2 million people in jail, there wasn't who knows how many police force, who knows how many judges, a whole system, you wouldn't be able to look at a video. You'd be too busy running away from someone or maybe being part of some gang just to protect yourself. So the point is that logic and good ideas create safety. And without safety, there's nothing. But the flip side is that when people are safe, they often don't think anymore. They just desire. They're emotional, like the child at home. He's shouting at his parents. You idiot. Your parents give you everything. Without your parents, you don't have anything. Have a little bit of respect. But in his head, there's like no understanding of what's come his way. There was a great rabbi, he gives an example of this. That imagine 2 people get shipwrecked. One is a child and one is an adult. And a very kind man takes them into the house. And he feeds them and he clothes them and he helps them. Now the adult will feel humble because this guy didn't have to do it. He's doing me a favor. The child will feel entitled. That's just the way it is. This guy does this. And if he doesn't do it, he's like, why didn't you do it? So that's the difference between the childish mentality. And then what happens is that the desires for just kind of imagine that the children suddenly get the power. And so what do? Well, so they just take all the money and they eat all the food, but there's no system to bring in more food. And eventually the society collapses. The whole thing falls apart. And that's what the liberals are trying to do. They're subconsciously, not consciously. Consciously, they're good people. But subconsciously, what they're trying to do is literally just take all the money and it's all going to fall apart. Like, let everyone in, no safety, because they feel safe. They've never felt fear. In fact, a friend of mine, he worked for the KGB, he told me that they called Americans unfrightened fools. And when you live in countries like I lived in Africa, where you know how evil people can be, you know that you need protection sometimes. Everybody's got barbed wires around their house for a reason. Nobody wants it, but you don't have it, you got a problem. So the second way you can tell what is true is the truth always agrees with itself. It's a pattern that always continues. And so we're in the final cycle of, really, in a way, America is miraculously saved by Trump, because there are many England, for example, they decided to get out of the European Union because these liberal countries in Europe invited all these Muslim terrorists in, or at least Muslims that hate Western society, and they're raping, and they're terrible. They're really evil. And they're having lots of children. So it's just a matter of time. Many countries, 2050, it's not a long time away, they're going to be Muslim countries. And just you wait and see, because there are statistics that show that, you know, when Muslims are about 2% of the population, they're like quiet and nice. They get to 5%, they start demanding rights. 10%, I don't remember the exact statistics, but start taking over. But once they take over, they have a religion which believes that you are a second-class citizen. And, you know, Jews in the olden days, I don't know, when they had to pay a poll tax and they would slap the person just to show I'm the big shot. And so Islam, radical Islam, is a real force. And it's obvious that Obama was a terrorist from the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood has a very if you want to call it, special brand of terrorism, which is that they infiltrate societies. And there's 3 ways a Muslim can get to heaven. Now, this is not to put down Muslims, because there are a lot of many good Muslims. They don't understand Islam itself. They're not allowed to read the Quran. I met a guy who was a former terrorist. He wrote 2 books, one's The Arafat Man and The Mind of Terror. And he told me that he tries to get former Muslims out of Islam. So I say, how do you do it? He says, I tell them to read the Quran. So you have to understand that once any sane person reads the Quran, their holy book, they'll say, well, you know, 30 times it calls to murder Jews and Christians. It's a hate manifesto. It's like worse than Hitler's Mein Kampf, because it's just pure sadism. But be that as it may, there are many good Muslims, because they don't know the Quran. They don't read the Quran. They just know 5 pillars of Islam. They don't realize that there's a 6th pillar. It's called jihad. And according to Islam, there's only 3 ways to get to heaven. One is kind of be good. The other is die in battle for Islam. Jihad, that's all these people that killing themselves, they believe. And the third is emigrate. And this is something the West must understand. ISIS had a plan of creating chaos to cause an emigration into Europe. So they caused 50 million Syrians to emigrate. That was a plan. They wanted to do that because then they believe, which they may be right, that Islam will take over just through emigration. And that's why Obama was very into allowing in Muslims. And now we have a Muslim terrorist as a congresswoman, an evil woman. And that is something that the Liberal Party, which is so they're so, again, it's all emotion based. Oh yes, let's welcome them all in. Well, what's going to happen is they're going to slowly but surely take over, and you'll become a second-class citizen. And if you're lucky, this is like kind of the enlightened Islam makes you second class. The non-enlightened Islam, where Islam really is today, if you're a woman, I don't want to say what they'll do to you. And if you're a man, they'll kill you. It's pretty simple. And if you don't believe me, look at ISIS, which happened right in front of our faces. So the third way that you know if something is true or not is a way that's taught by the Baal Shem Tov, the Holy Baal Shem Tov. And he says as follows. Each one of us, our brains are actually highly subjective. It could be objective if you're thinking. But in order to think, you can't be subjective. For example, if I tell you that you have an option to go to McDonald's. I don't know, you like McDonald's. Obviously, I'm kosher on eating McDonald's, but you love McDonald's. And I say to you, okay, you have 2 choices. Would you like to stay home or go to McDonald's? So obviously, you're going to say go to McDonald's. Say, do you think that's a smart choice? Yes, that's a brilliant choice. It's a wonderful choice. It's a great choice. McDonald's is a wonderful place. So in other words, the mind that has a subjective emotion is not objective. This moment, for example, when boys hit puberty, beforehand they weren't interested in girls. Now they can't get enough of them. So it's just an emotion, right? So emotions control logic. Desire controls logic. So in order to think objectively, you have to get rid of desire. And all desires boil down to 2. And that is, honor and pleasure. So now I want you to close your eyes for a second and imagine that I will be alone on an island for the rest of my life. So I will have no honor from no one. I'll have no pleasure from anyone. And now ask yourself, what would be a good way for society to function?